Hi, this is David Neese with EV World News, where we talk about electric vehicles, green energy, and the stock market. Today, I've got a couple of special guests with me. As many of you've seen, William Moore with me, with the founder of EV World, and we've got another special guest today, Mike Herzog. Welcome, Mike. How are you doing today?
Great, great. Glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting thing. So we're all people in the green energy space to some degree in Omaha, Nebraska. A place where it's just not something that's very common. Other parts of the world, you start going out to the West Coast, things seem like more a daily part of life. It's a little different here. What have been your perception of somebody in the Midwest as the reception you've seen to green energy in our environment?
Well, it's interesting because we see a lot of that with a lot of things, not just green energy, filter from the coasts into the Midwest. So we always have a little bit of a time delay. It seems like as we're going through that, and I don't think this idea of green energy is necessarily that different. So as it's starting to penetrate through, I think we're starting to see a lot more of it. Maybe the one exception to that is in the area we're at in particular. I don't think you can drive very far without seeing wind farms, and a lot of wind farms, and especially across the river. We're located in Nebraska, but in Iowa and in Missouri, and in Nebraska at this point, not necessarily where we're at, but more in the north central part of the state. We have seen a lot of wind farms pick up. So maybe some of that at the utility scale and the larger areas. That's pretty common, and we've seen a lot of it around here. But as it gets to the homeowner and business owners, that's maybe we haven't seen as much of that. People putting solar up on their homes and businesses in that area. So it is a little laggy. We're catching up at that level, but we've also at the grid scale, at the high level scale, we've seen quite a bit of that already too.
Oh yeah, we really see a lot of wind farms. You go up and down the I-80 corridor, all the way from Chicago, all the way out to Reno. I
Mhm.
mean, they're
Yeah.
all up and down. Especially you get out into Wyoming. Wyoming, I think, is even windier than Nebraska
Mhm.
and Iowa. So, Mike, you're in energy consulting. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, I can give you a little background about myself too. So I've spent, well, depending on how you shake it, 15 to 20 years in the utility space, in the electric utility space. My background's in electrical engineering. I'm a licensed professional engineer across a couple of states, Nebraska, and then a couple of states on the East Coast as well, where I've done that practice. And my background in the engineering space is really around grid planning, specifically around transmission and distribution planning. So accounting for changes to the grid, adding new building, adding new subdivisions, new restaurants, new hospitals, planning for that growth, and how we need to approach that from the infrastructure standpoint. We need a lot of these items are multi-year projects, and we need to be way out ahead. So we kind of have to have these plans laid up in place to make sure we have our facilities in the ground before the customer's ready for it. We don't want development waiting on power from that standpoint. So that's most of my background is working for a utility in that space and in various planning functions and supporting a lot of others in that area in that space. So lately, I'm in private consulting. I do work for a large consulting firm where it's at, but then I also do consulting on the side to help some local areas and provide some support in that space as well. So where I'm at right now in that, it's a lot of interconnection, distributed generation interconnection, and the difficulties in that, and challenges, and how to approach those problems. But then, kind of lending that perspective from the utility standpoint to other areas in industry, and how they can understand that picture a little bit better and where some of those challenges lie. It seems like in a lot of these cases, we're not necessarily speaking the same language. I think we're dancing around the same topics and what that looks like, but it's trying to bridge some of those communication gaps so it's not engineer speak or corporate utility speak. Trying to come back and not combat, but uh, you know uh, state their position and where they're at and why these challenges exist and where they're at to people who are looking to broaden these markets and broaden these areas and increase the penetration of green and electric vehicles and everything along those lines. So that's the space I'm working in right now, where I have the background. I can talk the utility talk. I can walk the utility walk, and where it's been. But how do we make that more tangible to the broader public, so they can understand those challenges too, and kind of build those solutions together, so we're meeting in the middle in the same good place.
Okay, so what is the type of customer that you consult for? Who would they be?
It would typically be utilities, who are looking for technical expertise. Approaching these issues, how would we, from an equation standpoint, from an integration standpoint, everything like that, actually doing the math and mechanics behind how these things work. But also very open to private industry as well, understanding that space, and how they can integrate themselves into it. When we're talking about utility scale and grid scale, there's a lot of challenges with regional authorities and planning and market participation, and how do you get your green energy or energy storage or whatever that might be into the market, and what's the best way to take advantage of all the different value streams to maximize your benefit in that space as you're going through. Understanding that to kind of the local space, where it's, you have to deal with a utility. They're going to give you a form. They're going to give you a checklist of all of these different things that you need to accomplish before you're actually allowed to connect to the grid. And if you don't have experience in that space, it's very complicated. It's very confusing. It's standards based. It is equations based. It's all of these different things in there. So if you're saying, hey, I have an idea, I'd love to add solar to my business. I would love to do this, or understand what it looks like. Well, the first thing they're going to say, well, go check out our website. We have the forms you need to fill out. And if you haven't looked at it before, it's, what the heck is that saying? I have no clue. And in a lot of cases, even if you have looked at those things before, it's, everybody does things a little bit uniquely. Everybody asks for things a little bit differently. And it's overwhelming at first. So some of it can be kind of just that entry point of, here's the bread and butter. Here's the basics. Here's what you need to know. Before you even engage in these conversations, you kind of got to have an idea of what that looks like. So that's that space I'm hoping to fill, and support where as needed, and especially at that utility scale. The large consulting firms out there are doing great work, and in there, and helping and supporting, just because, as you kind of led off with, maybe we haven't seen it a lot in the Midwest, but boy, if you go to the East Coast right now, they're inundated with these requests and people wanting to connect, and kind of shuffling through how that's actually going to work, and how the grid's going to change as a result of it.
It's funny when you talk about the answering the questions. I often tell people, it's like, I think people ask me questions about different things. I always tell them, I think you're asking the wrong questions. you know
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes
Yeah.
I think people ask questions just to, like, hey, I'm going to impress you. Let's see if you know the answer to this one.
Yeah.
But it's interesting kind of to see. I was telling you right before the call that I was speaking to somebody from California who was actually telling me, in California they have so much solar that there's more than the grid can actually handle. And it has to do with the fact that there's a timing mismatch between when the most solar is generated during the day. Like, they have a peak time for solar is between 11 and 2 in California, but the peak time for energy usage is between 4 and 9. And they don't currently have the battery storage to absorb all of that. And so people aren't getting their credits for sending power back to the grid. And it's really become kind of an interesting issue. And in other spaces, I'm seeing that there's as much as a 2-year delay in bureaucratic red tape of when somebody's had a new green energy project getting that's been built to be connected to the grid. And I was expressing my own 3-month wait after my own solar got installed till it was connected. And do you see any trends, at least in our part of the country, to address that?
Absolutely, and it's not just the Midwest. This is a challenge everywhere, and where we're at. There's a couple of underlying reasons for it and where we sit. So the grid we're operating today has its roots over 100 years ago. This is still the fundamentals of the grid have not changed in a very, very long time. Now technology has changed. We've gotten more efficient. We've gotten better at building things. We've gotten digital in the grid, and the way we control things, moving from old electromechanical devices to purely a solid state digital area where it's computerized and updated and everything like that. But the fundamentals of it really haven't changed. So a lot of different analogies you can look at for a space like this, but think about the interstate. We have the interstate system and everything like that. Power's flowed one direction for 100 years. It starts at the generator and it flows through our transmission system and substations and down to your house. So it's gone effectively one direction for a very long time. So you think about the interstate. Well, what if you started to have cars driving backwards on it, going against the flow of traffic? And that's what the utilities are dealing with right now, effectively. Of you're inverting what this model has looked like for 100 years. Now we can do it, like you think of the modern interstate today. Well, you have a path that goes this way, and then you have the other side of the interstate that's going the other way as you're going around it. So
I've
there's
seen people
solutions out
backing
there.
up on the interstate.
Yeah, exactly. And where we've seen it is, if it's one car, well, that's dangerous and it's scary, and all of these things happening. But you can handle one car. But what if it starts to be more than one car? What if it starts to be half of the interstate is going that way and it's backwards? So that's been one of the major challenges and delays of trying to get this all integrated. Is surely it wasn't built for it. The systems weren't built for this and what it's trying to do and what it's trying to add. So the other thing I'd add to that, and I'm an engineer, I'm a planning engineer, so I'm obviously biased in this space working for utilities, but the United States electrical grid's the largest machine in the world. It is the largest, most complicated machine in the world out there. And you might think, well, it's pretty straightforward and we can do it, and it's been this way for 100 years. It's engineered down to fractions of a second. For protection devices, to keep people safe, to keep equipment from blowing up, to keep all of these things from happening. So it's really, really complicated. And on the surface, there's those high level things like, well, I can just add it and it'll be okay. Well, yes, the first one, but then as you start to add more of them, it gets more and more complicated. So this entire chain from the high level of just kind of how does it fit down to engineered and planned and operated and maintained, to have that level of protection down to fractions of a second, it's complicated. And people are working through it, and people are trying to understand it and everything along those lines. But especially when you start to enter a space like the Midwest where we haven't seen a lot of it yet, there's a learning curve. And we need to understand what our systems are, and we need to understand what the limitations of those systems are. Now, thankfully, we have the coasts and Arizona's, and Florida's and places like that have walk this path a little bit before, so we can lean on some of that knowledge and understand what we can stretch things to, how we can approach it, everything along those lines. We're not going in blind. We're not blazing the trail in this space at all, at least in the Midwest. But every system's still unique. Every climate, every geography, every piece of electrical equipment, it's unique in those spaces. So we're still learning and what that means and how we can apply those things to our systems. And that's where those delays are generated from. It's taking that extra time. It's taking that extra study. It's taking these extra pieces to make sure that we understand what this is going to do to the system and how it's going to integrate. Now, when we talk about that at like the larger scale, so like huge wind farm projects that you drive by on the interstate, huge solar projects that are connecting directly to the transmission system, in a lot of cases, those are driving infrastructure upgrades as well. So it takes time. We don't just lay out transmission lines. Those are $100 million projects that take 5 to 10 years to complete. So you want to bring in as much information as you can and make sure you do it right. Like you don't want to put in something too small that's going to be undersized as soon as you get to the ribbon cutting ceremony. It's like, well, time to start planning the next one. We want to make sure we're ahead on all of that and planning it through. Typically going back 10, 15, 20, 100 years in this space, the generation we would add to the system was very infrequent. You would get in here and you would say, well, we're going to build a coal plant. We're going to build a nuclear plant. We're going to build a natural gas plant. Those don't happen very often.
Right.
One every 10 years, or something like that. Whereas the volume we're seeing from wind farms and solar facilities, dozens in a single year. So it's technically complicated, administratively complicated to manage all of this. Who got in line first? Who has to pay for this upgrade? It was fine until this last person came. Well, is it fair for that last person to have to pay for the entire thing, or should everybody have to share in those costs? So there's a lot of those nuances and details that are being worked out as we're going through.
Well, that's really been a lot of that development's really been slowed down because at current interest rates don't support the returns on solar and wind, even with the rebates and things for installing the solar farms from the federal government. It can't keep up with the destruction that the current interest rates have wreaked on that. I deal with people who issue green bonds, and I have some connections that have done $30 billion worth of solar installations, and other energy infrastructure. And, they're like, we're not doing anything right now. But I've also seen at the same time where this is kind of an interesting thing. So one of the talking points against electric cars and electrification of everything is that, well, where's this power going to come from? Where is all this for the grid? And I'm seeing other claims that right now the amount of excess energy that's being produced, that's capable of being connected to the grid, is almost 50% of total US energy usage is sitting through, we were talking about the bureaucratic red tape in a 2-year process, that we could increase energy output by 50% over what the US is currently using now. So I think that would eclipse anything that we're going to have as needs from electric cars. But it's interesting to see. It's like, well, are all of those, green energy facilities located strategically in a way that it matches demand, and that it also can be captured, as we were talking about, at the right time of day, things like that. And any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of energy in the queue. You'll hear regional authorities in different places. You call it the energy queue, and it's you get in line first and you save your spot, and you get studied, and you have kind of first rights to capacity, or however you want to connect in there. So, kind of to your first point, like there's a lot of energy in the queue. But going back to it's just, it's not a fun answer for people to hear. Look at it; it's complicated. It's very, very complicated to add it in. But as far as how it's located, how those curves match up to electric vehicles and what they look like, electric vehicles are really interesting in this space and what they look like. So I got my first EV just a couple of months ago, and I've studied EV charging patterns. I've studied a lot of that for a long time, but now I'm actually getting a chance to practice it and see what it looks like. And once you get past some of that range anxiety and realize you have flexibility in how you charge it, like I don't need to charge it every night if I'm just taking the kids to school and commuting back and forth to work. I need to charge it about once a week, and what that looks like. So when you start to build out that, and the idea that the charging of electric vehicles can be flexible, if people are okay with that and people are comfortable with it, to match wind, to match early morning solar, to match when the grid is at its minimum, that's a great thing. There's a lot of behavioral components we can look at with electric vehicles that are definitely in the realm of possibilities and need to be incorporated with electric vehicles as we start to go through. You mentioned California, kind of talking about peak hours and when the highest periods of demand are and what those look like. So yeah, it's the amount of generation we have, the amount of backup generation we have, the stress on the facilities, everything like that. It's really centered around what you'd call your peak usage in the utility. And right now in Omaha, Nebraska, we are in the middle of a heat wave. It's going to be, I think, 115 degree heat index today, and the same for the next 2 days.
I need to mow my grass.
Yeah, good luck. But as you start to build up that latent heat, and it's exactly the time period you said, where it's late in the afternoon, it's hot, everybody's ACs are running. And what adds a little bit onto the top for this peak period, it's kind of this special time where it's about an hour or two where you still have people in the office. So the office lights are still on. Well, even in a post-COVID world, the office lights are still on, the computers are on, the printers are running, everything like that. Then you have people starting to come home. And what really drives that peak period up and the highest demand is you walk in the front door and you turn on the lights, and maybe you start a load of laundry and you turn on your electric oven to get dinner ready, and the kids get home and turn on TV and Nintendo and everything like that. So you have this period where office occupancy is still high. Everybody gets home and does what they need to do. Holy cow, it's hot in my house. I'm going to crank down the AC. And that's just what we do. We're people. That's our habit. The challenge with EVs is if you're, I'm a plug in my cell phone every day kind of person as soon as I get home. If I'm the same with my electric vehicle, what do? I get home at 4 or 5 o'clock when the demand's highest, and I plug my car in right away, and it starts charging, and just exacerbates the worst period when we want to see that on there. So that's where it gets into this idea of you don't need to charge every day. Really, even if you wanted to charge every day, your vehicle's only going to be actively charging for a couple of hours at the most.
Hmm.
So what if you plug that electric vehicle in at 5 o'clock, but either through a utility controlled program, through your cell phone app, your charger, your vehicle itself, whatever that might be, say, oh, don't start charging till midnight. Let's let this peak period go by. My car is going to be plugged in for 12 hours anyway. It doesn't matter whether it charged at 5 o'clock in the afternoon or 10 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, I woke up in the morning and had a full charge. Made no difference to me and what that looked like. So that's kind of that idea. Hey, there's some artificial matching we can do to green energy sources, to electric vehicle charging, and exactly like you said, like minimize those conflicts, minimize those problems. Like let's fill in the valleys rather than adding to the peaks in that space.
And that's very interesting because I see a lot of misinformation out there in the marketplace about, well, how are we if we switch to electric cars? What is the goal? Is it 30% by 22 or something like that of cars in the U.S.? I saw a statistic just today saying that on the current roadmap of how EV sales have been increasing, we're looking at 35% of worldwide car sales being electric vehicles by 2030. And so that's without the U.S. government interfering with anything. Okay. Well, but that's because it's not in the U.S. That's because most of it is, in other countries. And what's nice is the countries or the world's two biggest polluters, India and China, are really heavy into this. I mean, they love it. They love doing their part. The people, have spoken. They're going to switch to electric cars, bikes. All of them are
Mm-hmm.
adopting it in a very good way to kind of offset maybe some of their industry and things like that. But it's just interesting kind of to see because there's this big perception that it doesn't matter how many cars. I hear this all the time because I talk to a lot of people in politics, and they're always like, "Well, we don't have the power to, for to handle all of these cars." And to me, what I'm seeing is we do. If we can do like what you're saying, if we can affect consumer behavior in a way to get them to charge, but somebody's got to develop this technology to have it so that the car, is charging at midnight, kind of thing. The
General Motors and Ford have both announced programs to. Ford, I think, probably leads in this, but Chevrolet has said that basically all of their electric cars going forward are going to have vehicle-to-grid capability. So instead of just being that one-way highway you were talking about, Mike, it'll be a two-way. And in fact, those batteries then become, in essence, part of the generation grid, not just the absorption of excess grid at night. So there is that potential, and those two car makers are moving, pretty, from what I've seen, at least announcement wise, moving pretty aggressively on that.
That's good. That's good. Well, one of the things, like I've featured ProTerra and their buses on the show before, and they just had this bankruptcy. I think ProTrader is going to survive. Okay, because they do more than just make buses. They've got other things with energy storage and some other things going on. I don't see people really influencing American behaviors, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I think I'm going to go take the bus today. Okay, and that's just, well, we live in a place where things are spread out. Okay, in Omaha, we have yards. Our houses aren't built, next to each other. And I mean, we have a mountain lion roaming around. I have coyotes that live behind my house. I mean, this
Just
this
over
isn't,
here.
yeah, yeah. We don't live in New York City or Beijing, or Mexico City, someplace like that where people are living on top of each other, and so buses here don't make as much sense. I've seen buses in Omaha. I know that they exist, but it's not the same thing. You're not going to influence some behavior there to be using them. Now, if you live in New York City, you don't necessarily need a car to start with, and you can ride, public transportation. So you've got these two extremes of ones where we need vehicles to get around in some form, and other ones where it doesn't make sense to even own a vehicle because there's no place, you can't afford to park it, you can't afford to drive it, and even if you did go and try to drive, you're just going to be sitting in traffic most of the time. You might have been able to walk just as fast as you drove. And so it's interesting kind of see these contrasts from big city life to not big city life, and how some of that changes in our market. But anyways, that's just me going off on my own rant, my own tangent. I tend to do that a lot, but I don't know. I'm glad to hear what you've had to say, because it's interesting to be able to reassure people that there's solutions coming down the path. And sometimes, and one of the things too, when we're dealing with power, while people sometimes think of, say, like in Omaha, we have OPPD, they're not a government entity, but they are a government regulated monopoly, to some degree, but they're still a private entity that is out there, and they have protected margins. So the way that utilities work as a monopoly, they're guaranteed to have a certain rate of return. Okay, so they're allowed to bill the citizens at an amount of money where they can't make over X amount of profit, but they don't have to make less than X amount of profit. So they can be anywhere in this small range. It's typically somewhere between like 8 and 12% profit on some number that who knows how that is calculated. But so, like, if OPPD spends a lot of money into research and development or increasing the grid, different things like that, that'll eventually get passed on as rate hikes to the citizens.
Just a point of clarification on that. OPPD is a governmental entity. It's a public power district, so it is a entity of the state. It's a political subdivision. So most investor, like the opposite model, is investor owned, which
Okay.
is regulated by like a public utility commission across the state. So, and they do have guaranteed rate of returns, but there also are structures, control structures for a lot of utilities around, cooperatives, municipalities, political subdivisions, entities of the state, different places like that are run a little bit differently. So like OPPD, for example, has a publicly elected board of directors
okay.
that are responsible for that. So very unique.
So opposite of
Not
like,
a lot of that.
so
But
like Ameren
yeah.
over in Missouri then would be one that would be investor.
Yes, 100%. They're an investor-owned utility.
What
So
about,
they do have guaranteed rate of returns on projects. They have to demonstrate what that means and what they need to do. But they're structured a little bit different. They still have to get approval from the PUC, the Public Utility Commission. But as long as it's reasonable, like we built this line because this new customer is coming and we had to do it. Okay, well, yeah, we're going to pass those costs along.
so the largest energy provider in the United States, at least in terms of geography, is Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, they provide power for like 7 states. And I've always been kind of under the impression, because I've known people who work for them as police officers. And so I've always been kind of the impression that they're probably a government or a quasi-government entity. So
TVA is, yep.
yeah,
TVA is
okay.
a public entity
But
as
that's a
well.
good. I'm glad you clarified that, because I see the stuff, whether it be a utility or whether it be and how they have these controlled monopolies. Even still, though, OPPBD, even if it is a government entity, it still has this ability to make sure it, you know, makes money, and it probably doesn't have to draw back on like the state or federal government to make things happen because of the way they're able to um, collect from, the private citizens. Correct? Or you don't know?
Um, no, not necessarily. So in a public space like that, they're not returning investment to shareholders or anything like that. So when you think about a public entity like that, at the end of the day, like they're not accumulating a savings account. Like they are spending the money that they take in. Now,
Okay.
granted, there's accounting, and everything like that, but it's their rates are approved and rates are developed to reflect the actual cost of service without margin on top of it. It's but every dollar coming in should be coming back out for betterment of the system or the actual operation and maintenance of the system.
Okay. Well, great, Mike. Is there if people were interested in reaching you, you're welcome to say who it is that name of your firm.
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn here. A Resilient Electric Analytics LLC is who I work for privately. I work for as well TRC companies, which is a very large consulting firm that does great work across a lot of different industries in that space as well. Just to be clear, I'm not speaking on their behalf today. I'm speaking as myself in that space, but they're right on the forefront of a lot of this development and studying and technologies, especially on the East Coast in that area. But from a private standpoint, yeah, I do some of that work on the side and try to get it cleaned up. And like I said, it's fun where I'm from. I'm an electrical engineer by trade and in the utility industry. And like I said, it's getting turned on its head for the first time in 100 years. So it's interesting problems to try to solve the big problem, the big problem that's coming to us from a climate change standpoint and what that looks like. So it's a good space to be in and a fun space to be in and ask questions.
Yeah.
If you're curious about this and what it looks like, it's always good to ask questions.
Yeah, and I apologize to John Vondra. On your LinkedIn, Bill, he's been asking, isn't it all government work? And he also suggested that we build more smart homes and plant more trees 24/7.
Among
Yeah,
all the other
yeah,
things we need to do. Yeah.
yeah. And I just noticed that we'd had messages in the chat. I'm really bad about
Oh, really?
following the chat feature. Yeah, that's something we're kind of new to the streaming. We've been
Yeah.
doing this for a few weeks now, and we're finding out more and more things. I'm going to go ahead, Mike. I appreciate you coming on and talking about this today. I'm going to go ahead and end the show. People appreciate everybody who listens in on this. If you enjoyed our content, please like and subscribe. And if you like the notification bell, then you'll find out when you'll be notified when we come on. We generally go about lunchtime in Central